Welcome back to Toronto Air Seminar. Today's talk will be given by Cameron. Cameron is a PhD student in the microrobotics lab at the University of Toronto, headed by Professor Eric Diller. His research interests are in magnetic microrobots and robot-assisted surgery. The main aim of his PhD work is to develop miniature tools for minimal invasive neurosurgery in collaboration with researchers and clinicians from the Hospital for Sick Children, also known as Sick Kids, in Toronto. He is responsible for the control theory and design methodology of the novel magnetic surgical tool in the project. Cameron is passionate about research projects that harness technological development for improving of the well-being of people and their communities. He completed his Bachelor's of Engineering and Master's of Applied Science at Dalhousie University in his hometown at Halifax, Nova Scotia. Yeah, Cameron, take it away. It's all yours.
Thanks, Reinhard, for the introduction. Yes, so like you said, today I'll be talking about my PhD work, which is tethered magnetic serial robots for minimally invasive neurosurgery. And I think we just covered this about me section, so I won't stay on it for too long. I got my bachelor's and master's from Dalhousie, and I really just wanted to highlight, of course, that today's work is a collaboration with a bunch of other people, particularly people at SIGIDI, at Sick Kids. That's a research department at Sick Kids, and also Professor Hani Naguib's T-SMART group, which is also in a graduate research group here at U of T in the Mechanical and Industrial Engineering department. So those are where my collaborators are from, and I really have to acknowledge all the great work that we do together. So before we get into the details of my project, I thought I'd give a little background to give some context to why we're doing this research in particular. One important motivation for our work is considering the application of epilepsy. So epilepsy is a brain disorder where electrical discharges in the brain can cause seizures in people who suffer from it. And those seizures vary in severity or frequency, but for some people, they can occur so often, or they can be so severe that they can be life-threatening or very disruptive to their day-to-day lives. Epilepsy occurs in about 0.7% of the population worldwide. And of that 0.7% of people, 20 to 40% of them require surgical intervention to help deal with their seizures, where medication might not be working to reduce their severity or frequency. And the method of the surgical intervention is called a functional hemispherotomy, or FH. And the traditional approach to performing an FH, which is the perinsular approach, which is on the right-hand side there, it's quite invasive. And what I mean by invasive is that it requires large cuts to be made in the patient. So this solid line, let me get my laser pointer here. This solid line here shows the incisions that have to be made through the skull. That's called a craniotomy. So you can see that quite a large portion of the skull has to be opened up in order for the surgeons to perform the surgery. The dotted line shows the incision in the skin that has to be made, and they pull back the skin to either side to access the skull for the craniotomy. So you can see that it is quite invasive. They have to open up a large window. And the reason why it's so invasive is that this FH procedure involves the disconnection of the two halves of the brain. So that means that you have to cut the brain in a lot of different places. It's somewhat illustrated on the right here. This isn't actually what it would look like when it's done, but this is sort of an exaggerated view, an artist's rendering to show you where the disconnections are happening in the brain. And so you have to do quite a few cuts over a large volume within the brain. It's quite a complex procedure. And so that's why, it has a relatively high level of invasiveness. And, further complicating this problem is that the patients are often young children, less than 5 years old. And the reason for that is that these procedures are more effective generally the younger the patient is. It tends to be safer and result in less seizure recurrence after the procedure for younger people, and improved outcomes cognitively as well. So, because of this, there can sometimes be cases where the patients have multiple comorbidities, or they can have these additional complications. This was one case that was taken from a paper that I was reading a while back. And to try to reduce the invasiveness of the procedure, instead of cutting that large window, they did the procedure with lasers. And with that, they were able to only burr several holes in the patient's skull, but it was still quite invasive. And you can see that this is a very young child that they're performing this procedure on. So we want to minimize the invasiveness, because generally speaking, less invasive procedures are safer. They require less time for patients to recover afterwards. So if we want to do that, a minimally invasive approach is going to need a few things. It's going to need distal force sensing, so sensing at the tip. Some methods of hemostasis, which is dealing with potential bleeds. And most importantly for this presentation is smaller, more maneuverable tools than what currently exists. And I think that really those tools have to be robot tools for the kind of maneuverability that we're looking for. So when we look at existing actuation methods for surgical tools, the most common one, which is in use right now, is cable pulley systems like the Da Vinci robot. That's a very common surgical robot that exists right now. I have an image of their tools on the right here, and you can see that there are these wires that wind around pulleys. And by pulling on these cables, you actuate the tool by pulling on the cables around the pulleys. And it has some disadvantages associated with it. I won't get into all the details on that. There are other potential actuation methods in development. Some groups are working on shape memory alloy actuators, hydraulic, pneumatic actuators, these magnetic transmissions. But what all of these actuation methods have in common is that they require wires, cables, tubes, or some kind of bulky transmission unit to pass through the trocar, which is the entry to the patient. So we want to keep that entry as small as possible. So our group came up with this idea, which was direct magnetic actuation. And this is something that's done for other kinds of small robots, but it's not very common for surgery. In fact, it's never been done for a surgical application. And what this would look like is you'd have a patient lying on a table, and underneath the table, you would have a system of electromagnets that project a low frequency magnetic field into the surgical workspace. And then within the patient's skull, you would maneuver some sort of wristed tool. So you'd have maybe a concentric tube arm or some sort of robot arm that maneuvers its way into the skull. And then it would have this wristed tool at the end. And the tool would have embedded magnets inside. And those magnets would respond to the magnetic field so that we can use the magnetic field to control the configuration of the tool. That's the basic idea behind our approach. And so that would look something like this. And what's particularly unique about this approach is that because it's wireless transmission of forces to the robot, we don't need to run signal lines or any sort of mechanical transmission to the tools. So that saves a lot of room for other systems. And you can see with this robot concept that there are in a surgical robot a lot of different systems that need to be included in the robot, such as lighting, vision, irrigation. Irrigation means you have some cleaning solution, like a saline solution, because surgery can get messy and you need to clean things off to see properly. You would have some arms for maneuvering the tools, maybe sensors for determining collisions. So with all of those systems needed for a successful robot, you don't really have much room left for transmission lines for the tools themselves. So we're going to take away the transmission lines and do wireless tools. And that's the idea behind our system. We did develop some previous tool designs, and these were really neat. But they didn't look much like surgical tools. They were a little bit flimsy. We actually made them by welding together nitinol, which is a nickel titanium alloy with different wires and parts. I won't get into all the details, but it was a previous work that a previous master's student did in our lab. So we wanted to move towards something that looked a little bit more recognizable as a surgical tool and really have a sort of systematic way for designing and controlling these tools. So that was my PhD, or is my current PhD. And the sort of number one objective is defining, I call it defining the theoretical physical principles of magnetic serial robots. So how do they work? Like actually coming up with a theory of how to design and control these things, which has never been sort of formalized by anyone else before. And so that would, be about creating this this theoretical interpretation, sort of a model of the devices. And then the second objective is to go from the model to a real tool design, to evaluate the feasibility of this approach, these magnetic serial robots, for our intended application, which is minimally invasive neurosurgery. And we came up with some basic design criteria for that. The tools would need to fit through a 2mm diameter hole, because ideally this endoscope would be no larger than 10 millimeters, so we could have a very small burr hole to enter into the patient's skull. It would be at least 100 millinewtons of force, which we determined reading literature on the kinds of forces that are exerted during neurosurgery. And it would have to be some sort of articulated wrist. It can't just be a straight wrist that just has an opening and closing tool. It needs to have some articulation to it. So with those objectives in mind, let's get into a little bit more of the details on how this device works. So you're all probably familiar with magnets on a basic level, even if you've never studied permanent magnet dynamics before. And I'm just going to briefly formalize that a bit so you can kind of understand where we're coming from on this project. So let's say that we have a magnetic field, which is usually represented by a B symbol. And these dotted lines represent the streamlines of that field. So areas where the streamlines are tighter, the field is stronger, and where they're further apart, the field is weaker. And the orientation tangent to these lines indicates the direction of the field. So we have some field projected into the workspace. And then in that field, we have some permanent magnet. And we can make some assumptions that allow us to represent that magnet as a single vector quantity, which we call a magnetic dipole, M. And the energy of this system is negative m dot b, the dot product between m and b. And so as you understand, for any physical system, it's going to tend to try to minimize its energy. It's going to have some sort of energy gradients that cause forces and torques on the system to try to bring the system to its minimum energy state. And so what that means is that because we have this negative here, it's actually maximizing the dot product. And the dot product is maximized when the torque causes our magnet to align with the direction of the field, so that M and B are parallel, and a force that draws M towards regions of higher B, because the larger B is, the lower the energy of the system. So if we can control the magnetic field, both the shape of the field, so where the field is dense and where it's more open, and also the direction of the field at a given point, then we can control the torque and the force on the magnet and use that to do more complicated maneuvers with magnets. And this is something that's been done in small-scale robots for decades now. But this is sort of a new application and a new scale that we're looking at. So let's sort of take that idea and apply it to something a bit more complicated. So this is a concept rendering of a magnetic serial robot, which is a serial mechanism, and maybe it has some revolving joints, it has some sliding joints. In this particular example, it has 4 links plus a base link that might be connected to ground or some other object. And so we can use standard conventions in robotics to define the axis of motion of each of those joints, usually indicated by a K hat or Z hat, depending on what you prefer. So each of these joints is going to have some joint axis. And then each of those axes is going to have what is called a generalized coordinate associated with it. So for a revolving joint, that generalized coordinate is going to be an angle, theta. For a sliding joint, that would be a joint position, D. And this is all standard for any serial robot. What's new for this particular kind of robot is that in each link, we have some embedded magnetic material that could have some orientation in the link. It's fixed, but some designed orientation. And those magnets, there's going to be one in each link. And that is how we control the robot. So unlike in a conventional robot where there would, say, be a motor at each joint, we have these magnets instead. And we need to figure out, okay, there's sort of two questions. One is, if we're given a robot like this, and we know the orientations of all the magnets, how do we apply a torque to each of those joints to get the configuration that we want? That's one question you can ask. And then the harder question is, given some kinematic skeleton of a robot, what should the orientations of the magnets be to have like the best design that can be fully actuated and apply the most force? Like, what's the optimal design, or even just what is a good design for that robot? And that's what I'm trying to answer with my PhD. So in order to do that, we need a dynamic model. And when you're doing a dynamic model, at the end of the day, you're doing sum of forces is equal to mass times acceleration. But because of the nature of a serial robot, we often reformulate this in a little bit of a different sense. And we write this H inertia matrix times the second rate of change of our configuration, Q, with respect to time. So Q is just a vector of all of those generalized coordinates. That's going to be equal to the sum of the generalized forces. And so much like how the generalized coordinates could be both rotations and translations, generalized forces can be either torques or forces. So we can assemble that into one big equation. This is pretty standard for a serial robot to have an equation that looks something like this, where we have our joint values, our generalized coordinates in the vector Q. We have our joint space inertia matrix on one side. We have all the generalized forces that are functions of both the configuration and the rate of change of the configuration. So those would be things like friction, Coriolis, and centrifugal forces. Now, I know that those are fictional forces you might recognize from first-year physics, but because we're dealing with a non-inertial reference frame, we have to include the fictional forces in our dynamic model. And then we have those generalized forces that are only functions of the configuration of the robot. So the current position of the robot links, such as gravity or joint stiffness. And I've highlighted joint stiffness in red here. These two are highlighted in red because this is where the magnets come in. You know, the rest of this is standard robot stuff. Where the magnets come in are on these last two terms. And the joint stiffness is highlighted because you can imagine that not only are these magnets affected by the field that we've projected into a workspace using our coils, but they're also going to be exerting forces and torques on one another because two magnets near to one another will attract or repel. So that is going to cause this sort of stiffness behavior in the robot. And I wrote another paper on that I won't be talking about in detail today, but if you have more questions on that, you can ask me and we can discuss that a little bit. Today, I'm really going to be focusing on this last term, which is the applied magnetic generalized forces, tau B. And that is a function of both the current robot state or the current configuration and also the coil currents, the electromagnetic coil currents that we're applying. And this is our control input. So you'll notice that all these other forces are simply functions of our robot state. And then this force here, this is where our control comes in. So if we take a closer look at that, I haven't given you the derivation because it's long and complicated, but let's just look at the result and you'll have to trust me that this is right. So part of my thesis was deriving this, where we have the coil currents on one side, we have the generalized forces, these applied generalized forces on the other. And it's a relatively simple expression. You can see that it's linear with respect to the coil currents, which means that our rate of change of our state is affine with respect to the currents. And so we can see here that there's two components here that are relevant. There's this magnetization matrix mu, which is a function of our current configuration. What that means is that as the robot reorients itself in the space, the orientation of its magnets is changing because the link orientations are changing. So if the magnets are in a new orientation or new position, we have to think about how that affects what field we need to apply to our robot. So that's what's encapsulated in this magnetization matrix, is how the orientation of the magnets changes as the robot moves. And then the other important component is this electromagnetic coil matrix, which is usually a constant for each coil design. And so if we take those two matrices, we can clump them together into a single matrix called B. And by analyzing this matrix, we can draw some conclusions about the nature of our robot and how we go about designing it. So one critical conclusion that we need to draw is that if the rank of B is less than n, where n is the number of joints or links in our robot, then the system is going to be under-actuated. Our robot is under-actuated. That's a technical term in robotics. So what is under-actuation, and why is it a problem? Well, if you've ever taken an advanced like nonlinear controls course, you've probably seen something like this, the inverted pendulum problem. This is a classic lab instructional tool called the Quantzer cube, which I used when I took a nonlinear control course, so I thought it would be instructive here. And so this is an inverted pendulum robot. And the way it works is that you have a single link. This center link has a motor that can rotate it left and right. And then your second link, which is this pendulum, is completely unactuated. There's no actuator associated with it. It just hangs limply. So the interesting thing about this kind of robot is that it is controllable from a technical sense, but it is under-actuated because one of the links does not have an applied actuator to it. And what that means is that if we want to achieve certain states with that hanging pendulum, we need to leverage the dynamics, and that leveraging is this sort of swinging motion that you can see here, where it has to swing it to bring the pendulum up into the vertical position. And I would propose to you that the dynamics of a surgical robot shouldn't resemble the dynamics of an inverted pendulum. If the doctor says, move the tool to here, we don't want it to have to swing to get there. We want it to have a smooth, controllable motion from point to point. So we don't want to have to be leveraging the dynamics of the robot to do that. So that is why I say that for our systems, we want to make sure that our robots are fully actuated. So we can dig a bit more into this full actuation concept. And if we look at this expression again here, we have the generalized forces, applied generalized forces on the left. We have our coil currents on the right. We have this B matrix. We can use something called singular value decomposition to split up that matrix. Every matrix can be represented as a rotation, a scaling, and a rotation. And the scaling is really the important part here that I'd like to focus on. That scaling matrix, capital sigma, is something like this. It's a diagonal matrix, and it has these lowercase sigma values on the diagonal. And the top left is usually the largest one of those values. It's called the largest singular value. And the one in the bottom right is the smallest singular value. And the smallest singular value is related to the rank of the matrix. And if that small singular value is 0, then we've lost full rank. And if it's very small, then we find that our matrix is very poorly conditioned so that it's effectively lost rank. And so generally speaking, we can use that to draw some conclusions about what we want our B matrix to look like based on this smallest singular value. So the takeaways from this dynamic model is that if sigma n is very small, that's our smallest singular value is very small, then the system is going to have poor actuation performance. It's going to have low strength. It's potentially going to be under-actuated or effectively under-actuated. So we can use that to define a performance metric. Perhaps you could use that for optimization. I haven't done that yet, but it's certainly something you could do, which is the smallest singular value, the smallest of the smallest singular values for all configurations that a robot can have. Because remember, that B matrix changes as our configuration changes. So if a magnetic serial robot is to be fully actuated, well, sorry, this is a separate conclusion, and I won't dwell on that right now because I am running a little short on time. But this is really the main takeaways. We want to maximize that smallest singular value. So what does that look like for the design? So here is our robot actuation design. We have the applied generalized forces on the left. we have our coil currents on the right, and we have, remember, these two components of that B matrix. We have the magnetization matrix M, and we have the coil matrix L. So the coil matrix is based purely on the coil system design. It's independent of that serial robot end effector. It's important for the end effector, but the L matrix is independent of it. And then we have the serial robot kinematics and the magnet arrangement, and that's what determines MU. So it's the geometry of our robot and where the magnets are placed in the robot and how they're oriented within the links. And that is really the focus of my work. The other part of it, the coil system design, was done by another student. This is what he came up with. It's a pretty fantastic system. It's really one of a kind. I don't think there's really anything else that quite has the workspace and power like this one does. You can get a sort of idea of the size based on this chair here. You can see how large this system is. So he designed this system. So my L matrix is fixed. I don't get to choose it. It's based on what he designed for me. And thankfully, it's a very good L matrix, which helps with my work. So the focus of my work is on that MU matrix and ensuring that it's properly conditioned. So with that, I developed a Matlab model. I put together some designs in SolidWorks, and using the Matlab model, I was able to measure or estimate what the smallest singular value is going to be. So I put together a Matlab simulation using the robotics toolbox, and came up with this particular design, which happened to have the smallest singular value of 27 micronewton meters per amp. That's a little abstract. So I've put together some more intelligible specs here. The dimensions of the robot are 4 millimeters in diameter compared to the Da Vinci's 5 millimeter diameter for their smallest tools. Has a length of about 20 millimeters, a compactness of 6.6 millimeters, which is the measure from one joint to the other, compared to the Da Vinci, which their larger tool has a 9 millimeter compactness and their smaller tool has a 19 millimeter compactness. That was something that they found, was that in order to make their tools smaller with these cable mechanisms, these cable-driven mechanisms, they had to increase the turning radius quite significantly, more than double the turning radius. So ours has both a small size and a small turning radius, which I think is a pretty good result. In terms of the output forces, so this is related to that smallest singular value. The larger the singular values are, the more output force and the better actuation performance we get. And I have a predicted minimum gripping force of 88 millinewtons and a maximum grip force of 180 millinewtons. So our maximum force greatly exceeds our target gripping force of 100 millinewtons, which you might remember from the start. Now, the only problem is that our gripping force is proportional to the characteristic length squared. So what that means is if we take this robot design and we scale it down by a constant factor in all dimensions at once, let's say we go by a factor of 2, because our target diameter was 2 millimeters. This design has a 4 millimeter diameter design. So if we scale down by a factor of 2, we're scaling our forces down by a factor of 4. So what that shows us is that, that would put us below our target gripping. So chances are a 2 millimeter robot with this type of design, this direct magnetic actuation, is just not going to work, which is okay. We're coming up with other means of doing such small tools. But for now, we have pretty small tools. They're smaller than the state of the art and in terms of robot tools. So we're pretty hopeful about these. Another unique aspect about this design is I designed it with sensor integration in mind, and it has this hollow core in the middle. There's just a hole running down the center. So the basic idea would be that you could run wires, like for sensors, down this hole. And this is something you can't do with any of the other actuation types, because this inner space is going to be filled with the transmission mechanisms that you need to move the robot. So that's sort of a unique aspect to that design. So that about covers the work that I've done so far. I'm going to talk a little bit about some summary here and some future work. So first of all, to summarize, the whole motivation behind our work is tool miniaturization. We need smaller tools if we want to advance minimally invasive approaches to neurosurgery, and that will make surgery safer for people, especially for smaller patients like children. Our idea was to use direct magnetic actuation to do this, which is wireless, so we can eliminate the need for a transmission mechanism, which makes more room for other components, other functionality in the robots. I personally developed a novel model and performance metric for designing these robots, and I'm working on developing some novel designs right now. I've designed a serial robot prototype, and they're currently printed, and we're waiting on the next steps for that, which I'll talk about in a moment. And my colleagues also designed a coil system for clinical scale applications. And my other colleagues are working on sensor integration and system integration with an endoscope robot. So the conclusions so far for my work are that I've developed a new robot prototype. It's fully actuated for all configurations, which is very important. So it's not under actuated. It has a predicted maximum force that is greater than our force target. It was designed with sensor integration in mind, which is a unique property of it. It has that inner hollow channel, which is not possible with other actuation types. And it has a 4mm diameter, 6.5mm compactness, which is, depending on how you measure it, 1.3 to 2 times smaller than existing Da Vinci EndoWrist tools, which are kind of the state of the art in robotic surgery right now, but they are larger than our 2mm target. In terms of future work, I have the control theory figured out, but it's a matter of implementing the open loop control with these tools to confirm predicted forces, demonstrate full actuation. We also want to do closed loop control, which is important for tool safety in a real application. For now, we're going to be working on a simple case with 2 orthogonal cameras with computer vision feedback, but realistically for future applications, we need to develop systems that work on the harder case where we'd have a single endoscope for computer vision feedback. I'm also working on new tool designs with more degrees of freedom. Right now, it's just a single actuation for the wrist and opening and closing on the fingers, but we'd like to have more articulation on that wrist. And we're also working on integrating the robot with the CTR continuum tube robot and do a surgical task demo. Something that I'd like to sort of qualify all this work with is that, I'm an applied scientist. And that's really what I consider myself, like a roboticist and applied scientist. But there's a lot of critical engineering work that might not be very publishable that needs to be done before anything like this can actually be used in a real, surgical application. The user interface needs to be designed. We need to look into material compatibility like toxicity, sterilization, manufacturing it for mass production, reducing the cost of the system. The electromagnets are incredibly expensive. And designing these tools for functionality. I'm not a surgeon. I don't know the difference between DeBakey forceps and Cadier forceps. So having, integration with surgical tool developers and doing all this sort of stuff, which might not really be publishable work. And so that's sort of something that needs to be taken forward. And maybe, some of it we will do in our lab, but I think, well, for example, animal trials and clinical trials, that is publishable and that will eventually be done. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge my funding sources, the project as a whole, but also myself individually was funded by these sources. And I'd also like to again thank all my collaborators and colleagues at U of T and SickKids. Went a little over time. Here's some references if you're curious about the image sources. Thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, Cameron, nice talk. I like the application and also that you use CTCRs or concentric tube continuum robots. Do we have some questions from the audience? Okay, let me start with one question. So you mentioned with the B matrix, you can compute the single values, and you try to maximize the smallest single value, right? Mm-hmm. What is the maximum you can? Is there like an upper bound? So if you relate the largest and the smallest one with a factor, what's the maximum factor if the factor goes between 0 and 1? Right. So if it's 1,
it's theoretically possible to have 100%. Like your maximum, like your largest singular value and smallest singular value could be equal to one another. That is possible. I think it's unlikely. Usually the smallest singular value is like, so for example, if we look back at these specs here, and we look at the minimum grip force compared to the maximum grip force, these are somewhat related, not directly, but they're closely related to the singular values. So you can see that with 88 compared to 180, it's about a factor of 2 between the smallest and largest singular values for this particular robot. And those aren't necessarily occurring in the same configuration. So what it means is that maybe the robot is really good at gripping when it's like in this orientation, because it's relative to the coils themselves as well. They factor in. So maybe the coils are stronger if your tool is pointing downwards compared to pointing sideways. So that's sort of where that's coming from and how those values can differ. But yeah, I'd expect a factor of 2 in most cases.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm wondering, how do you do the configuration estimation of this small gripper, especially in surgical environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is a major challenge for pretty much all surgical robots with any kind of endoscopic approach. Is feedback is incredibly limited. And that gets far worse when we're dealing with neurosurgery, because the skull is opaque to things that you might use in other applications. Like when you're doing abdominal surgeries, you might be able to use something like ultrasound, for example, but the skull is opaque to ultrasound waves. So you would have to cut another hole somewhere if you wanted to use an ultrasound transducer. So it's a very challenging problem. What we're moving forward with, and it's not my project, but a master's student project with this particular group, we're working on having endoscope feedback with, so you have a camera on your robot. So, you know, it's like the surgeon stuck his head inside of the skull, and using that camera for feedback on the tool. And it's a very challenging problem, single camera feedback. You know, ideally at the minimum, you'd have binocular vision and you could use that with point correspondences or whatever, but often it's monocular vision for these endoscopes. So I mean, I don't have a full answer for you there, really. We want to avoid, like, there are things you can use like X-rays or fluoroscopic imaging. We want to kind of avoid that because, you know, these surgeries take hours. And so you don't want to be exposing patients and operators, like all the nurses and doctors in the room, to X-rays for hours at a time. So we've really like looked at a lot of different options, and it's, yeah, it's an incredibly challenging problem. So, you know, good for hitting on that. Like, that's a very good question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, another question is like, have you got any like real world video for your robot, or it's like it's still in the development and you are working on theory?
So I have an older video here of a previous design. It's a little shaky because we didn't have the closed loop working on it, and we had 2 side views. So this is a smaller design. It was actually 3 millimeters that we were working on before. And this was from the paper I briefly mentioned that I did on the magnetic springs. Like, you get this spring effect between the magnets. So that was sort of the focus of the work. But here's what that looks like. And you can see there's a bit of friction, which causes a sort of jerky motion. So a lot of the recent designs have been focused on trying to reduce the friction in the robot. But here it is, like, there's no wires or anything to it. It's just held in place on a little jig to hold it in the center of the workspace. And so we can control these 2 degrees of freedom. So this is very similar to the new design. It's just a little smaller and quite a bit weaker. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks.
I have a question. Cameron, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. A lot of innovation on board. I'm wondering, how far do you think we are from using magnetic actuation in real operating room with surgeons?
Yeah, Yeah, that's a very good question. Because I think, you know, as I'm sure you're aware, because you know we work in the same field, that there are already like some like catheter guiding magnetic devices where you have a catheter that is steered by magnetic fields. So it is being used already, but not for surgery. So for surgery specifically, I would say that, you know, maybe this is too pessimistic of me, but like probably 2 decades, maybe one. You know, yeah, it's very challenging to say. Like I can see how long it took me to sort of develop just the theoretical side of things, and everybody knows that like like theory doesn't fight you. When you actually start sitting down and dealing with real objects, then things start breaking and things start working not the way you expected them to, and all that sort of stuff. So like if it took me, you know, 3-ish years to sort of develop the theory and a first prototype, I feel like we're looking at a much longer time still for really like dealing with these problems that I brought up in this sort of practical consideration slide. Like I think before this can be used safely for a real patient, all of these things, and probably some things I missed here, all of these things need to be covered. And that's a lot of serious engineering. And it's not necessarily engineering research, it's the kind of engineering that's like, you know, more of a commercial kind of engineering that needs to be done. So I don't know if, I think at some point it has to sort of exit the lab and sort of enter the commercial space where, you know, a startup or some company would sort of put the finishing touches on this. I guess one thing I didn't even cover here was all the approval, like FDA approval and all that sort of stuff that you need. So yeah, I'd say like optimistic 10 years, pessimistic 20. Yeah, but thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I think that's expected with this new application for magnetic actuation. That is completely expected. Thank you so much.
We have more questions. Yeah, Cameron, you mentioned that the diameter, so you kind of derive that the diameter cannot be smaller than 2 millimeters, yes, because it's too weak. I would suspect this is also because the magnets right now are like constant magnets, so they are not electromagnets. What happens if you would substitute the neodymium magnets with a coil?
Yeah,
is this possible? Do you see any benefits?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's because you're right. Coils can be much stronger than permanent magnets. Permanent magnets, as you've mentioned, have an upper limit on their magnetization, so that is going to put an upper limit on the strength of the robots. And so with this robot, I used, I think it's N42 magnets, which is a grade of magnetization. You could up that to N52. It would need to be custom designed. You could maybe eke out a little bit more magnetic volume on the tools as well. Like you could fill in some more parts of this, but again, you'd need custom magnet designs by a company or whatever to produce that. But in terms of replacing the permanent magnetic material with electromagnets, that would definitely improve strength. But the question is, would the strength be better than simply putting in something like a shape memory alloy actuator, which has a really, really high strength, but it requires electricity to run it. So once you're adding in the electrical signal lines, I think if you're going to do that, there might be better options than magnets. I think that really magnets will only shine in cases where you can leverage the wireless nature of the magnetic actuation. I think that is sort of the killer feature of magnetic actuation. And so if you do away with that, I don't know that you're really getting the sort of best bang for your buck there. But yeah, that's a really great point. improve the strength, it could definitely be done.
Thanks, Cameron. Good talk. So in your vision, I see you want to apply your gripper and the tethered instrument. So what about the untethered? Do you have any vision about using your gripper and a untethered instrument inside the human body for doing some procedure?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. Because it's fully wireless, you could technically untether it, and other people in our group, other PhDs have done untethered robots that can sort of walk around and do cutting and things like that. So I think you could do that with these tools. My concern would be that the strength would drop quite a lot, because when it's connected together like this, as a bunch of links, so often magnetic gradients, this is sort of something that I didn't get into too much in the presentation, but when forces are applied by the gradients in the field and torques are applied by the direction of the field. And so when you untether the tool, you can only make it move with, you can sort of roll it, or you can push and pull it with magnetic gradients. So I think once you do that, once you've sort of disconnected it and you're relying on the magnetic gradients solely for, say, like pulling on a piece of tissue that you might be wanting to resect, I think that it gets very challenging to produce high enough forces to pull that off. But it is like a very good question. And it really would be something that would greatly enhance the applicability or the sort of usefulness of magnetic tools if they could be run untethered. I think there are whole other challenges with untethered tools that you would also have to consider from a safety perspective, because you don't want to be leaving magnetic objects in a patient's body when you finish a surgery, especially in their brain. Just because, if they came near a magnetic field later, you would be pulling an object through their brain, which would be very bad. So having untethered tools, I'm not sure how you do that safely to ensure that they always come out when you're done. Yeah, it's a big challenge, but I think maybe some other people will probably handle it.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, if you have some question, just unmute yourself. Okay, maybe I have one last question. You mentioned one of the future goal is to implement a closed loop controller. What is kind of the control frequency you can expect in this kind of application? It cannot be that fast like the inverted pendulum, right? But it's also not the goal.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a study that I was looking at a while ago that was looking at the frequency components of a surgeon's motions during brain surgery. And they found that usually the frequency of those of the motion, the frequency components of a surgeon's motion were less than 10 hertz, which makes sense because we expect a pretty smooth, controlled motion during these processes. So, if that's the kind of motions that we're expecting to need to replicate, then at minimum our controller would have to be updating at least 20 hertz, right, because of the Nyquist condition, but like ideally 100 times faster. Now that opens up an interesting problem though, which is that the cutoff frequency of our electromagnets The larger you make an electromagnet, it's a big inductor, right? So the larger you make an electromagnet, the lower its cutoff frequency is. So because of that, you know, we have to drive more and more and more current to produce these higher frequency variations. The other thing too is that, you know, I mentioned briefly at the start that magnetic fields are safe. They can penetrate tissues and not cause, they're not radiation if you keep the frequencies low. But once you start to sort of exceed 100 hertz, especially at the magnitudes that we're dealing with, which is around 0.1 Tesla, that can start, it's not reaching dangerous levels, but it's the kind of place where, like with MRI machines, you know, I've read about doctors or technicians walking past the bore of an MRI machine, and because they're passing through a magnetic field that's changing, they see sparks in their vision because a changing magnetic field produces an electric field. So, you know, it's not dangerous, but it's definitely something we would want to avoid as much as possible. So yeah, like I think the control is going to be just hardware limited to low speeds as much as possible. And then finally, there's the matter of feedback from the endoscope camera, like getting high frequency. Like I think it's not unreasonable to expect like a 60 hertz update rate from you know 60 frames per second from a camera. So that's probably good enough for the kind of control we need to do. But yeah, those are the sort of limitations that I would see on the sort of speed of a controller that would be designed for these tools.
Oh. Yeah, interesting for the why you use these really big coils? It's probably to get the power, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So it was a very interesting challenge. You know, I was closely involved with Adam's work. Adam was our master's student who put together these coils. So, you know, I'm familiar with a lot of it, and he spent a lot of time trying to design a good electromagnet. And it's really quite challenging because, you know, we're working with surgeons, specifically Jim Drake over at Sick Kids. And he was very clear that a surgeon doesn't want to be blocked from their patient. They want to have full access to their patient. So he didn't want, like, your task as a designer becomes far easier for the electromagnets if you're allowed to enclose the patient like an MRI machine and have a borehole. In that case, you can make your magnets quite a bit smaller because magnetic field is like a flow. It's like a flowing current. And so if you can pull it from the top and push it from the bottom, it works a lot better than just having like a bunch of things at the bottom trying to push it up through. So that's kind of how I visualize how the field works. So because we were limited to only be below the patient and not in the way of the surgeon, that meant that we just had to like really produce as big magnets as we could. And the other tricky thing is the bigger you make them, the farther away they move, and your magnetic field scales with the fifth power or the fourth or the fifth power of distance. So the farther away you put them, the bigger they have to be, but then the farther away you have to put them. It's an incredibly challenging design problem, and Adam did very well with it. But yeah, that's why they have to be so big, is to get the fields that we need, to get the strength we need, the frequencies we need, and still fit within the package that is specified by our partners, our collaborators. So yeah, it's a wonderful project. It's so cool. There's so many different aspects to it. I could talk about it all day.
Because I thought about you could use several small magnets around the skull, right? But then then it's just a big obstacle for the surgeon. Yeah.
Yeah, and
small
you know,
details.
It is, and I like maybe that wouldn't be a problem if you could quickly remove it. Like if you could slide the patient in and out of it rapidly, because I think a lot of what the surgeons are concerned about is emergency access. something goes wrong, there's a bleed, and now they need to do, instead of a minimally invasive, they need to go fully invasive. They need to get in there and sort of do things a little more manually to try to save the patient's life. And they don't want to have all this stuff in the way. So maybe if you had a system that could be rolled in and out really quickly, maybe they would be okay with having less access. Hard to say, because then there's other things too, like anesthesia needs to fit on the patient's mouth, and like I mean I'm not an expert on surgery, so I don't know all the systems that are involved, but I know there's so much going on in that surgical workspace already that I can understand their concern with adding like another thing to that area. But yeah, you're totally right. It would be an easier problem if we could surround. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, do we have one more question? I don't think this is the case. Yeah, Cameron, thanks. Great talk and all these insights regarding the application and the constraints. Yeah, thanks for your time. Really great talk.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it was great.